Well, merhaba brothers and sisters, and günaydın, or perhaps iyi günler or iyi akşamlar, depending on what time you're watching. Welcome to Mission Zero, and this is episode 4. Wow, it's been a whole month. Episode 4 of The Word with Friends. Today we are going to talk about patience. So before we get into the video today, last week we talked about grace. If you haven't watched the grace video, go ahead and click here to watch that. In the week since making that video and making this video, a couple of things have happened in Texas where I live that are probably worth discussing as it relates to grace. So the first is last week a man broke into the house of his ex-wife and murdered her boyfriend, their 3 children that he shared with his ex-wife, and shot her. She survived. And so now she has to deal with the loss of her 3 children, her boyfriend, and she doesn't even get to be mad at her ex-husband in any physical way because he turned the gun on himself and killed himself. The second thing that happened at the end of the week, last week, is a 17-year-old boy walked into an art class, killed his teacher, or I presume it was his teacher, and shot and killed 9 other students and wounded 10 others. Both of those things show a couple of different dimensions of a profound lack of grace. And so what do I mean about that? There is the grace, the outpouring of emotion, right? We talked about that last week. Grace is this outpouring of emotion and love and connectedness to another person. The ability to walk into a room and kill multiple people shows an abject lack of that grace. But lest we pin evil on people who do these things, there's always a start to it. There's always a lack of grace shown to that person. People that are capable of murder, especially mass murder on a large scale, there is an inability to unlock that grace, that connectedness, that love. And I think that affects far more than just the people who are able to walk into a building and murder people. It also extends to a lot of America, right? We are, as a planet even, we are so divided, so vastly divided, so many arguments about race and religion and gender and sexuality and politics and finance and just every metric you can possibly think of. We are so staunchly divided that we can't even see our opponents as human beings anymore. We have lost that ability, and that more than anything is why I created this channel, and what I'm trying to do here is convince us all that there is a better way. And I think that ties deeply into what I want to talk about today, which is patience. Okay, so I've talked a lot about patience in the past. I shared a video on Facebook that was specifically dedicated to patience. This is not going to be that message, but I'll borrow from that message, so I'm going to put a link in the description. There is a long blog post I made late last year about patience, and again, I'm going to borrow from, but not steal that message. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But let's start off talking about patience with the English definition of patience. So Webster defines patience in a few different ways. There is the ability to withstand pain or suffering. There's the ability to bear, right? You think you're bearing a load. There's not hasty. So you think about you were patient through a situation, right? And then probably my favorite is steadfastness in the face of adversity. All of these you can see are about the fact that patience is about getting through something. Well, let's take a look at that in some other languages and see how that sort of holds up. Okay, so the English word patience comes from the Latin word pati, and pati means long-suffering. So you see how that kind of makes that tie. Well, if we go back to some other languages, let's pick Greek, for example. The Greek word for patience is makrothumeo, which is really fun to say, and I highly recommend it. The root of makrothumeo is it's sort of a three-part word. There's makros, thumos, and eo. So eo means to be made of, macro means long, and thumos means anger or passion or heat. Well, how did that sort of play in? The root word for thumos is the Greek word thuo, and thuo means to sacrifice or to kill. And more specifically, it's to sacrifice in a fire. So, makrothumeo means to be made of a long immolation, right? Immolation is to be burned in a fire. Well, that's sort of a stilted kind of a word. What is the concept? That makrothumeo is your ability to withstand and not perish, right? To suffer long. Well, that's pretty darn bleak, isn't it? Let's take a look at another language. Let's go to the Hebrew. So in Hebrew, the word for patience is arech, and that just really means slow. The root word of arech is arach, and arach is to prolong, to draw out, to make long. It's this idea of, it's drawing a thing out. But there's no suffering you can see in that. That's not about pain. That's just about length, about duration. And in fact, the word for long suffering in Hebrew is arech af. And af is the suffering part. Arech is just the long, the slow. So in Hebrew, the idea of patience was not about pain or burden. It's just about length. Okay, that's fantastic. So how about, for example, Aramaic? Aramaic is probably my favorite definition of patience, because in Aramaic, the term for patience is nagira ruche. And nagira ruche means long of spirit. And that's capital S, spirit, as in the Spirit of God. Well, what does that mean? The Aramaic concept of patience is also about enduring. It's about lifting up. And you can think about that in two different ways. There's the, withstanding the oppression of something that's weighing down on you, but there's also just the lifting up of anything, any perceived issue or burden or length, right? It's all of these ideas in one, and the concept behind it is that the thing that fuels patience is the Spirit of God. We talked a couple weeks ago in the session about fear. If you haven't watched it, click here. But we talked about the fact that Jesus pointed out a lot, particularly to Peter, that what you think you know is not always what you know. I talked about the scene where Jesus is asking the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter stands up and says, "You're the Messiah, you're the Christ." And Jesus says, "You didn't learn that from men or from me. The Holy Spirit gave you that." And so I talked about the fact that Peter had to be like, "No, that's not right. I came up with that." Right? This is that same thing. When you are patient, when you find your peace in a thing, that's from God. That's the support of God. Now, why is that important? What does that mean to you? Why should you care about that in the least? Well, I think it's because there is a lot of people whom I've talked for the last couple weeks about the trust problem people have with God. And I think patience is the perfect place to highlight it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4, it starts off with a very well-known series of phrases. It's the descriptions of what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, all this stuff. In the King James Version, the beginning of that is, charity suffereth long. I've talked about the fact that no idea in the Bible exists separately from every idea in the Bible, and one of the ideas in the Bible is that God is love. God is the definition of love. So we could say God is long-suffering. And certainly we can get there. We understand that God has to deal with us, and boy, is that suffering. But the problem with long-suffering is that there's a finite point to it, right? Patience requires an other side in our terminology, right? When you say someone was patient through a situation, what you mean is they started at point A and they got to point B without blowing up. If God has that same quality, then it means there's a stopping point to what he's willing to put up with. And you can point out those stories in the Bible all day, right? David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back, and it starts to slip off the cart that it's on, and a man named Uzzah reaches out and touches the Ark to steady it, which no human hand is supposed to touch the Ark, and so Uzzah is struck dead. I think we all sort of fear that we have somehow wandered astray of God, and that he's going to strike us dead, just like Uzzah. There's, in the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira sell their house and they're going to give all the money to the church. They come to the church and they give just a little less than the full thing. And because they both lied, they were struck dead by God then and there. I think we are all just deeply, deeply concerned that we've told the last lie God's willing to put up with. There's Lot's wife. Right? Lot and his family are fleeing from Sodom because it's going to be destroyed for its evil. And God says, whatever you do, don't turn back. And Lot's wife turns back around to look at the city, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Man, doesn't that seem sort of a random and cruel God? Because, well, who wouldn't look back to see what's happening to this city that you've spent years living in that's now being destroyed? And I think many of us read that and can fear the sort of intermittentness of God. What's the thing that I'm going to look back on, or that I'm going to feel a pang of nostalgia or regret for, that he's going to hate and kill me for? There's the story of Job's kids. Right at the beginning of the book of Job, the thing that starts Job's really horrible, awful, very bad series of months is all of his kids are murdered. And we don't really know if they deserved that or not. We just know that it happened. And so a lot of us wonder, are we going to be punished for God to teach someone else a lesson? And finally, there's Judas, right? Judas that takes his pieces of silver to turn Jesus over to the authorities. I think a lot of us vilify Judas primarily because we can identify with what he was probably going through. He was raised in a Jewish household like the rest of the disciples, and there has to be that gnawing on you as you watch Jesus go around and do these things, and the world is against him. There has to be a pang of doubt. And I wonder, did that first pang of doubt for him occur when Peter stood up and said, "You're the Christ," right? There are things that are so outside of our comfort zone that we can't possibly accept them. And so we wonder, like Judas, have we held to a belief that's caused us to go afoul of God and he's going to destroy us? All of these things, all of these instances, and 100 more I could cite off the tip of my tongue, show that God just can't be trusted to deal with our humanity. But that's so wrong. It's so, so wrong. When I talked about grace, I pointed out in Genesis 6:8 that God looked upon Noah and Noah found grace in God's sight, and the fact that that means God had an outpouring of love and connectedness to Noah. But the thing that I didn't say, the thing that I held back, is God feels that same outpouring of love and connectedness with every single beating heart on earth. Jesus said the words, "I came that none should perish." Do you believe for 1 second that God's going to fail in that mission? I think we like to walk around and point to this person who did that thing wrong, and this person who thinks about that thing wrong, and this person who's just wandering astray and doesn't know what they're talking about. We get into these legalistic fights about the interpretation of the Bible or religion or who's right, or do all religions belong in one bucket and they're all stupid, or do all roads lead to God? And we get into these arguments about who gets to play in God's playground. But the living Christ said, everybody is invited. Now, does that mean everybody goes to heaven? No, because what's the one thing God will never do? Override your free will. And so you can choose, through a lifetime of rejection of Him, to go the other way. But that's between you and God. That is not for any of us to lay upon you. When the Bible says iron sharpens iron, so many people take that to mean I get to sharpen you. I get to point out the speck in your eye and correct you for it. That's not what it means. If you don't know me well enough that I can have love and connectedness to you and you can have love and connectedness to me, you have no business. Listen to me really clearly. You have no business telling somebody how to live their life. If you are not in a heart space that you are trying to help them, and this "and" is so critical, and they are in a heart space to receive it, right? Most of us have probably stumbled past intervention on TV at some point and realized that that often doesn't go well because you're attacking a person. You're not trying to edify a person. You're not trying to build a person up. And so what does any of this have to do with patience? It's because our definition is wrong. Patience is not endurance. Patience is the thing that no matter what you're going through, the Spirit of God will uphold you. Not to be trite and go to cliche, but there's the story from, at least circulated a lot when I was a kid, that there was two paths, two sets of footsteps going down the sand, and that was me and Jesus beside me. But then in some parts of my life, there was just one set of footprints, and I asked Jesus, why did you abandon me in those times? And Jesus said, no. Those are the times that I was carrying you. And that's been said a lot. That story's been told a lot. I don't know that a lot of people find meaning in it anymore. But it's absolutely true, and it's right there in the word patience. It's right there in the virtue of patience, is that God upholds us, and He does that because He has grace on us. God is not long-suffering. God is eternally suffering. There is no end to it. He is not about to strike you down like Uzzah, or Ananias and Sapphira, or Lot's wife, or Job's kids, right? These are stories that teach lessons that are important, but the truth is we have no idea what happened to any of those people. We just don't know. We're not given that information. And a lot of people cover that by saying, and it's well-meaning, God works in mysterious ways. Or the slightly more intellectual, well, we don't know the purpose for God in that action. That's stupid. It's completely wrong. The Bible is filled cover to cover with the core purpose of God and the explanation of why and how He does what He does. But you have to have the full context. You have to have the correct perspective. God doesn't work in mysterious ways. God has one focal purpose. He wants to bring your heart into a place that you are open and can show grace to Him and can receive His grace and be connected to Him. For this mother who lost her 3 children and her boyfriend and watched her ex-husband do all of this and then kill himself, how does that connect her to God? How is she ever supposed to pull grace out of that? That I don't know. because I don't know the inner workings of the human heart. Only God knows that. But what I do know is that the Spirit will sustain her through it. And if we can just see that, if we can just attach to that, if we can get the correct perspective to accept the grace that God is pouring out on us, there is no thing in this world that could ever disrupt us. The joy of the Lord, the peace of the Lord is found in that patience. That is patience. Patience is not just enduring through a situation, because often the situation is something that won't change. The kids that were killed at this school, there isn't an undo button for that. They don't come back. Those parents have to deal with that. Those families have to deal with that. Patience is not about waiting until the other side. It's not waiting out the grief. It's choosing to connect back to God and to celebrate the beauty of life. That's really hard sometimes. It's really hard. We're all going through something. We all have something that hurts us right now. Something that we can latch on to and disconnect from God with. But even in that rejection of Him, even in your gritting your teeth and surviving through, it's not you who does that. It's not you who allows you to survive. The thing inside you that drives you on and that makes you able to deal with all of this is God. Not what somebody else, including me, has told you God is, but the God that loves you and has grace towards you and only ever wants your heart. Okay, I'm going to cut it there, and I would desperately love to talk to you about this video or any of the other videos that you've seen. So put some love in comments. If you liked it, give me a like. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. If you want to get push notifications of the new videos, hit the little bell. Next week, I will be back to talk about authority. And I love you all, and God bless you, and keep you safe, and keep your hearts focused always on Him. Peace out.